In the unforgiving wilderness of the Arizona Territory, where the line between civilization and savagery blurs like heat waves on the desert horizon, some rescues come with a price that cannot be measured in gold or silver. When death stalks through the mesquite and the howls of predators pierce the night air, survival often demands choices that reshape destiny itself. This is the story of how a single act of courage in the face of certain death bound two souls together in ways neither the cowboy nor the Apache maiden could have ever imagined. What began as a desperate fight against nature's most ruthless hunters would transform into something far more complex, dangerous, and life-altering than either of them was prepared for. The year was 1887, and, in this harsh land where the strong survived and the weak became memories scattered by the desert wind, Thomas McKenna was about to discover that sometimes saving a life means surrendering your own freedom forever. The morning sun cast long shadows across the rugged terrain as Thomas McKenna urged his horse through the narrow canyon pass. The sorrel mare beneath him moved with the careful steps of an animal that had learned to survive in this unforgiving landscape. Thomas had been riding since before dawn, following cattle tracks that led deeper into Apache territory than any sensible cowboy should venture alone. At 28 years old, Thomas had spent the better part of a decade working ranches throughout the Arizona Territory. His weathered hands gripped the reins with the confidence of a man who had faced down stampedes, rattlesnakes, and the occasional band of rustlers. His blue eyes, now squinting against the harsh morning light, had seen enough hardship to age him beyond his years. The Colt .45 on his hip was well used but well maintained, a tool as essential as his saddle or boots in this wild country. The cattle he was tracking belonged to the Bartee Ranch, where Thomas had been working as a foreman for the past 3 years. 20 head had gone missing during a thunderstorm 2 nights prior, and the ranch owner, Samuel Turner, had offered a substantial bonus for their safe return. Thomas knew the terrain better than most, having spent countless hours riding the boundary lines between civilized ranchland and the wild Apache hunting grounds. As his horse picked her way through the rocky outcropping, Thomas noticed fresh signs that made his blood run cold. Wolf tracks, numerous and recent, crisscrossed the cattle trail like a deadly map. These weren't the tracks of a lone wolf or even a mated pair. This was a full pack, and, by the size and depth of the impressions in the sandy soil, they were hunting with purpose. The tracks told a story that Thomas could read as clearly as printed words. The cattle had been moving at a steady pace until they encountered the wolves. Then, the tracks showed panic, scattering, and the inevitable outcome when prey animals faced organized predators. Dark stains on the rocks confirmed what Thomas already suspected. Some of the cattle hadn't made it through the night. Thomas followed the trail as it wound deeper into the canyon. The walls rose higher on either side, creating a natural funnel that would have trapped the terrified cattle with nowhere to run. Vultures circled overhead, their patient vigil telling him he was close to finding what remained of Turner's missing herd. The smell reached him before he saw the carnage. Death had a particular scent in the desert heat, one that no amount of wind could completely carry away. Thomas dismounted and ground-tied his horse, drawing his rifle from its scabbard. The mare's ears were pricked forward, her nostrils flaring as she caught scents that spoke of danger still present. Around the next bend in the canyon, Thomas found them. 7 cattle lay scattered across the canyon floor, their remains picked clean by the efficient work of the wolf pack and the scavengers that had followed. The sight was brutal but not unexpected. This was the harsh reality of life in the territory, where nature's law was written in blood and bone. What Thomas hadn't expected was to hear a human voice calling out in distress. The cry came from somewhere ahead, echoing off the canyon walls in a way that made it difficult to pinpoint the exact location. Thomas moved forward carefully, his rifle ready, every sense alert for danger. The voice called out again, definitely female, speaking in a language he didn't recognize but in a tone that clearly conveyed desperate fear. As Thomas rounded another curve in the canyon, the scene before him stopped him in his tracks. A young Apache woman, perhaps 18 or 19 years old, had climbed onto a large boulder about 8 feet off the canyon floor. Below her, 3 massive wolves paced back and forth, occasionally leaping up toward the rock but unable to reach their intended prey. The woman was beautiful in a wild, untamed way that took Thomas's breath away despite the danger of the situation. Her long black hair hung in 2 thick braids down her back, adorned with small bones and colored beads that caught the sunlight. Her deerskin dress was torn in several places, evidence of her desperate flight from the predators. Her dark eyes blazed with a fierce intelligence and determination that spoke of someone who had no intention of surrendering without a fight. In her hand, she gripped a bone-handled knife, the blade gleaming as she brandished it at the wolves below. She was chanting something in her native language, possibly a death song or a prayer to her gods. Thomas realized with growing urgency that while the boulder provided temporary safety, the woman was trapped. The wolves showed no signs of giving up, and, eventually, exhaustion or thirst would force her down to their level. The largest of the three wolves, a gray-black monster that must have weighed close to 120 pounds, suddenly caught Thomas's scent. The animal's head swung toward him, lips pulling back to reveal fangs that could crush bone. A low growl rumbled from its throat as it took a step in Thomas's direction. Thomas had faced wolves before, but always with other men and usually with the advantage of being mounted. These three were clearly the survivors of the larger pack that had taken down the cattle, and they had the confidence that came with a successful hunt. They were well-fed and, therefore, more dangerous, as they weren't driven by the desperate hunger that sometimes made wolves reckless. The young Apache woman's eyes met his across the canyon floor, and, for a moment, time seemed suspended. Thomas saw fear there, yes, but also a pride that refused to beg for help, even from a stranger. She had stopped chanting and was watching him with an intensity that made him feel as though she were measuring his soul. Thomas made his decision in that instant. He couldn't leave another human being to die, regardless of race or the potential consequences of involving himself with an Apache in this hostile territory. The recent Apache wars had left both sides suspicious and quick to violence, but, at this moment, none of that mattered. What mattered was that three wolves had a woman trapped, and he had the means to do something about it. He raised his rifle and took careful aim at the largest wolf. The animal was quartering toward him, presenting a good target for a heart shot. Thomas controlled his breathing, let out half a breath, and squeezed the trigger. The Winchester's report echoed through the canyon like thunder. The big wolf dropped instantly, the heavy .44-40 bullet taking it through the chest. The other two wolves startled at the gunshot but didn't immediately flee. Instead, they turned their attention fully toward Thomas, recognizing him as the greater threat. Thomas worked the lever action smoothly, chambering another round. The second wolf, smaller but no less dangerous, began moving toward him in a stalking crouch. Thomas tracked it with his rifle barrel, waiting for a clear shot that wouldn't risk hitting the canyon walls and creating dangerous ricochets. The wolf suddenly charged, covering the distance between them in powerful bounds. Thomas fired, the bullet taking the animal high in the shoulder and spinning it sideways. The wolf yelped and rolled, but struggled back to its feet, wounded but still very much a threat. The third wolf, seeing its packmates killed and wounded, finally decided that discretion was the better part of valor. It turned and loped away up the canyon, disappearing among the rocks and shadows. Thomas quickly chambered another round and approached the wounded wolf carefully. The animal was trying to crawl away, its left front leg useless from the shoulder wound. Thomas didn't want the creature to suffer, but he also couldn't risk it recovering and becoming a future threat to other travelers. He ended its misery with a well-placed shot. The sudden silence that followed the gunshots was profound. Even the vultures overhead seemed to pause in their circling. Thomas looked up at the Apache woman, who was still standing on her boulder refuge. She was staring at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. There was gratitude there, certainly, but also something else. Something that made him suddenly uneasy. "Ma'am," Thomas called out, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture of respect. "You can come down now. The wolves are gone." The woman studied him for a long moment before responding in accented but clear English. "You have saved my life, Cowboy." Thomas was surprised by her command of his language, but he tried not to show it. "Just doing what any decent person would do," he replied. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head and began climbing down from the boulder with the fluid grace of someone who had spent her entire life moving through rough terrain. When she reached the ground, Thomas was struck again by her beauty and the dignity with which she carried herself, even in her torn and disheveled state. "I am called Ayana," she said, moving closer to him. "It means eternal blossom in my people's tongue." "Thomas McKenna," he replied, automatically removing his hat.
I'm pleased to make your acquaintance, Miss Ayana. She smiled at his formal politeness, revealing perfect white teeth.
You speak to me as you would to a white woman, she observed.
This is unusual for your kind. Thomas felt heat rise in his cheeks.
A lady is a lady, regardless of her heritage, he said quietly. My mother raised me to show respect to all women. Ayana's smile widened, and she stepped even closer. Thomas caught her scent, a mixture of sage, leather, and something uniquely feminine that made his pulse quicken despite himself. She was studying his face with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. Your mother raised you well, Thomas McKenna, she said softly.
But she did not teach you the ways of my people, did she? No, ma'am, Thomas admitted. I can't say that she did.
Ayana reached up and placed her hand flat against his chest, directly over his heart. Thomas felt the warmth of her palm through his shirt and found himself unable to step away. Among my people, she said, her dark eyes never leaving his, when a warrior saves the life of a woman, especially in combat against the great wolves, it creates a debt that can only be repaid in one way. Thomas felt a chill run down his spine despite the heat of her touch. What kind of debt? He asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Ayana's hand remained pressed against his chest as she spoke words that would change the course of his life forever.
The life you have saved now belongs to you, Thomas McKenna. And so do I. You belong to me now, just as I belong to you.
This is the way of my people, and it cannot be undone. Thomas stared down at her, his mind reeling with the implications of what she was saying. He had come into this canyon looking for missing cattle and had somehow acquired something far more complex and dangerous than he could have ever imagined. The Apache woman before him was claiming that his act of rescue had bound them together in some way that he didn't understand but that she clearly took very seriously. Now wait just a minute, Thomas began, but Ayana silenced him by pressing her finger to his lips. There is no waiting, she said firmly.
What is done is done. The wolves are dead, I am alive, and you are mine. This is how it must be.
As Thomas looked into her determined dark eyes, he began to realize that his simple act of decency was going to complicate his life in ways he never could have anticipated. The Apache woman before him was serious about this debt she claimed he had created, and something in her manner told him that she wasn't going to be easily dissuaded. The sun was climbing higher now, and Thomas knew he needed to continue tracking the remaining cattle if he hoped to earn Turner's bonus. But, first, he had to figure out what to do about Ayana and her unexpected declaration of belonging. One thing was certain, his quiet life as a ranch foreman had just become significantly more complicated. Thomas stood in the canyon trying to process what Ayana had just declared while simultaneously scanning the surrounding rocks for any signs of the remaining wolves or other dangers. The morning was advancing, and he knew that staying in one place too long in Apache territory was asking for trouble, especially now that he had an Apache woman with him whose presence would raise questions he wasn't prepared to answer. Miss Ayana, Thomas began carefully, I appreciate your gratitude for what happened here, but I need to be clear about something. I'm not looking to acquire anybody or anything. I was just doing what I thought was right. Ayana tilted her head slightly, studying him with those penetrating dark eyes. You speak of what you want, Thomas McKenna, but you do not understand what has already happened. Among my people, some things are beyond wanting or not wanting. They simply are. She moved away from him and knelt beside the largest dead wolf, drawing her bone knife. Thomas watched with fascination and growing unease as she began to efficiently skin the animal, her movements practiced and sure. The blade moved with surgical precision, separating hide from flesh with minimal waste. What are you doing? Thomas asked. Taking what is useful, Ayana replied without looking up from her work. The wolves took the life of your cattle, but they also have gifts to give. Their pelts will make warm blankets when the cold season comes. Their teeth and claws have power for ceremonies and protection. Thomas had to admit her practical approach made sense, even if it made him slightly queasy to watch. He had skinned his share of animals over the years, but there was something different about the way Ayana worked. Every cut seemed purposeful, respectful even. She murmured words in her native language as she worked, what sounded like prayers or thanks. How did you come to speak English so well? Thomas asked, partly out of genuine curiosity and partly to fill the silence while she worked. My father traded with the white soldiers at Fort Apache for many seasons before the troubles began, Ayanna explained, her hands never pausing in their work. He believed that understanding the language of one's enemies was the first step to survival. He sent me to learn from the missionary woman who came to our village when I was small.
Your father sounds like a wise man.
Ayanna paused in her skinning and looked up at him. He was. The soldiers killed him 3 winters ago during a raid on our winter camp. They said he was harboring renegades, but he was only trying to keep our people fed during the hungry season. Thomas felt a stab of guilt and sympathy. The Apache Wars had claimed victims on both sides, but he was beginning to understand that the lines between right and wrong weren't as clear as he had once believed. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said quietly. "He died with honor," Ayanna replied simply, returning to her work.
"That is what matters."
As she finished with the first wolf and moved to the second, Thomas found himself studying her with growing interest. There was a strength about her that went beyond the physical, a kind of inner steel that he had rarely encountered in anyone, male or female. She worked with calm efficiency despite having nearly been killed less than an hour earlier, and there was no tremor in her hands or voice that might indicate shock or fear.
"Where were you heading when the wolves found you?" Thomas asked.
"To the white man's town called Tucson," Ayanna replied.
"I have business there." "Tucson?"
Thomas was surprised. "That's more than 40 miles from here, and most of it's through dangerous country."
"You were traveling alone?" Ayanna finished with the second wolf and began cleaning her knife on a handful of coarse grass. "I travel as I choose, Thomas McKenna. I do not ask permission from men, white or Apache."
There was a flash of steel in her voice that made Thomas realize he had stepped into territory he didn't understand. Clearly, this woman was not typical of what he expected from Apache females, though he had to admit his knowledge of their culture was limited to stories told around campfires and the occasional encounter in trading posts. "I didn't mean to imply that you needed permission," Thomas said carefully. "I was just concerned about the dangers.
This is rough country for anyone traveling alone." Ayanna stood and faced him directly.
"And yet you are here alone, tracking your cattle through the same dangerous country." Thomas had to smile at that.
"You've got a point there, miss.
I suppose we're both a bit foolish in our own ways." For the first time since he had met her, Ayanna's stern expression softened into something that might have been amusement.
"Perhaps foolishness is what saved my life today," she said.
A wiser man might have heard the wolves and turned back.
"Maybe so," Thomas agreed. He looked around the canyon, noting the position of the sun.
"Speaking of which, I need to continue tracking those cattle before the trail gets too cold."
"What are your plans now?"
"I will continue to Tucson," Ayanna said without hesitation.
Thomas felt a knot forming in his stomach.
"Miss Ayanna, I can't in good conscience leave you to travel that distance alone, especially after what just happened. But I have a job to finish, and my boss is expecting results."
"Then, we have no conflict," Ayanna said matter-of-factly.
"I will travel with you until your work is done, and then we will go to Tucson together."
"We will?"
Thomas asked, feeling like the conversation was moving in directions he hadn't anticipated. "Of course," Ayanna replied, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world.
"I told you, Thomas McKenna. You belong to me now, just as I belong to you. Where you go, I go. This is the way it must be."
Thomas rubbed his jaw, feeling the rough stubble there. "Miss Ayanna, I'm trying to be respectful here, but you keep talking about this belonging business, and I don't rightly understand what you mean by it." Ayanna gathered up the wolf pelts she had taken and fashioned them into a neat bundle using strips of rawhide from her dress. "Among my people," she explained patiently, "when a warrior saves a woman from death in battle, especially death by wolves, it creates a bond that cannot be broken. The woman's life belongs to the warrior because he has earned it in combat. But the warrior's life also belongs to the woman because she now carries the responsibility of that debt." Thomas was beginning to understand, though he wasn't sure he liked where the explanation was heading.
"And this bond, what does it mean exactly?" "It means we are bound together until death," Ayanna said simply. In your language, I believe you would call it marriage, though it is more than that. It is a joining of spirits that your Christian ceremonies cannot touch.
Thomas felt his heart skip a beat.
Marriage? Now hold on just a minute. I never agreed to marry anybody.
Agreement has nothing to do with it, Ayana replied calmly. You chose to fight the wolves to save my life. In that moment of choice, the bond was created. What we think about it now does not change what has already happened. Thomas stared at her, his mind racing. The Apache woman was serious, completely and utterly serious about this marriage bond she claimed existed between them. He could see it in her eyes, in the way she carried herself, in the matter-of-fact tone she used when discussing their shared future.
But, I don't even know you, Thomas protested. We just met an hour ago. Time is not important, Ayana said.
What matters is the bond forged in blood and danger. I know you are brave, because you faced the wolves alone to save a stranger. I know you are honorable, because you could have left me to die and taken what you wanted instead. I know you are skilled with weapons and wise in the ways of the wilderness.
What more do I need to know?
Thomas found himself at a complete loss for words. The woman's logic was alien to him, but there was an internal consistency to it that he couldn't easily dismiss. More troubling was the realization that despite the apparent insanity of the situation, he found himself attracted to her confidence and strength.
What about love? Thomas asked finally.
Where I come from, people usually marry for love.
Ayana's expression softened slightly. Love may come or it may not, she said.
But respect and partnership are more important for a strong marriage. I can respect a man who risks his life for a stranger.
Can you respect a woman who would rather die fighting wolves than live in fear?
Thomas had to admit that he could respect that, more than respect it actually. The courage Ayana had shown in facing down the wolves, even when trapped and seemingly helpless, was something he found deeply admirable.
And, if I refuse this bond you think exists between us? Thomas asked. Ayana's eyes hardened again.
Then, you dishonor both yourself and me, and bring shame upon the spirits that guided you to save my life. But, more than that, you break something that cannot be repaired, and both of our souls will be damaged by it. The weight of her words settled on Thomas like a physical burden. He was beginning to understand that this wasn't simply a matter of cultural differences or misunderstanding. Ayana genuinely believed that his rescue of her had created a spiritual bond between them, one that she viewed as sacred and unbreakable. I need time to think about this, Thomas said finally. Think while we travel, Ayana replied. But know that thinking will not change what is already true. Thomas gathered up his rifle and walked back to where his horse was waiting patiently. The mare snorted softly as he approached, and he patted her neck while he tried to organize his thoughts. When he looked back, Ayana was standing nearby with her bundle of wolf pelts, clearly ready to travel. You don't have a horse, Thomas observed. Apache women learn to run long distances before we learn to walk, Ayana replied. I will keep pace with your horse. Thomas doubted that, but he didn't argue. He mounted up and set off following the cattle trail again, glancing back to see Ayana trotting along behind him with the easy, ground-covering stride of someone accustomed to traveling on foot across difficult terrain. The trail led them out of the canyon and across a series of low mesas covered with scrub brush and scattered boulders. Thomas found the tracks of the remaining cattle easily enough, noting that they had continued to move in a generally northward direction, probably seeking water and grass after their terrifying encounter with the wolves. Ayana kept pace with his horse without apparent difficulty, her steady breathing and fluid movements suggesting that she could maintain the pace for hours without tiring. Thomas found himself impressed despite his concerns about the situation she claimed existed between them.
As they traveled, Thomas tried to make sense of his predicament.
According to Ayana, he was now bound to her by some kind of Apache marriage bond that he had inadvertently created by rescuing her from the wolves. The logical part of his mind rejected the idea completely. He was a Christian man raised in a civilization that believed marriage was a voluntary contract entered into by mutual consent, preferably with love as its foundation. But another part of his mind, a deeper and more primitive part, responded to the idea with something that wasn't entirely rejection. There was something appealing about the certainty of Ayana's worldview, the way she spoke of bonds forged in blood and danger that transcended ordinary human concerns about compatibility and romance. More troubling was his growing awareness that he found Ayana herself deeply attractive. Her beauty was obvious, but it was more than that. Her strength, her courage, her quiet dignity in the face of circumstances that would have broken a lesser person, all of these qualities drew into her in ways that had nothing to do with physical appearance. The sun climbed higher as they continued following the cattle trail. Thomas estimated they had covered about 8 miles when they came across the first of the surviving cattle, a young bull standing in the shade of a large rock formation. The animal was uninjured but clearly nervous, its head coming up sharply when it caught sight of them. "Easy, boy," Thomas called out softly, guiding his horse in a wide circle around the bull. "Nobody's going to hurt you." Ayana watched the proceedings with interest. "You speak to the animal as if it understands your words," she observed. "Maybe it does, in its own way," Thomas replied, continuing his patient approach to the spooked bull. "Cattle are smarter than most people give them credit for. This one's been through a hell of a scare with those wolves. He needs to know he's safe before he'll trust us to lead him home." Thomas spent the better part of an hour working with the bull, gradually earning its trust and getting close enough to fashion a rough halter from a length of rope he carried in his saddlebags. Ayana watched the entire process without comment, but Thomas could feel her eyes on him throughout. "You have patience," she said when he finally had the bull secured. "Necessary quality in this work," Thomas replied. "Rushing cattle usually ends up with somebody getting hurt." They continued north, leading the captured bull and following signs of the remaining animals. By afternoon, they had found and secured 4 more head, bringing their total to 5. Thomas was pleased with the progress, though he knew they still had 8 cattle unaccounted for. As the day wore on, Thomas found himself stealing glances at Ayana. She had maintained her steady pace without complaint, and her presence had actually been helpful in several instances when they encountered nervous cattle. The animals seemed to respond to her calm energy, and she had an intuitive understanding of their behavior that impressed him. During a brief rest stop beside a small spring, Thomas finally worked up the courage to address the elephant in the room. "Ayana," he said carefully, "this bond you think exists between us. What exactly would it mean in practical terms?" She looked at him with those dark, intelligent eyes. "It would mean that we face life's challenges together," she said. "We share our strengths to cover each other's weaknesses. We protect each other from danger and provide comfort in times of sorrow. We raise children who are strong and wise because they have learned from both Apache and white ways." The mention of children made Thomas's heart rate quicken. "And if we discover that we're not well suited to each other?" "Then, we learn to become well suited," Ayana replied without hesitation. "The bond is not broken by difficulty, Thomas McKenna. It is strengthened by overcoming difficulty together." Thomas drank from the spring and splashed cool water on his face, trying to clear his thoughts. Everything Ayana said made a certain kind of sense, but it went against everything he had been raised to believe about marriage and relationships. "In my world," Thomas said finally, "people usually court for a while before they decide to marry. They get to know each other gradually and make sure they're compatible before they make such a serious commitment." "And how often do these marriages succeed?" Ayana asked. Thomas had to think about that. In his experience, marriages based on lengthy courtships didn't seem notably more successful than those arranged by families or based on practical considerations. "I suppose success depends on how you measure it," he admitted. "Our marriage will succeed because it must succeed," Ayana said with quiet conviction. "We are bound by forces greater than personal preference or temporary emotion. That gives us strength that your courtship marriages lack." As they resumed their journey, Thomas found himself considering Ayana's words more seriously than he cared to admit. There was something to be said for the certainty of her approach, even if it terrified him at a personal level. The afternoon sun was beginning to slant toward the western horizon when they encountered their biggest challenge yet. The remaining 8 cattle had apparently taken shelter in a box canyon similar to the one where Thomas had found Ayana, but this one had a narrow entrance that would make driving the animals out a difficult proposition. "We'll need to be careful here," Thomas said, studying the terrain. If we spook them too badly, they might scatter in all directions, and we'll spend days trying to round them up again. Ayana stood beside him, also studying the canyon mouth. Among my people, we sometimes hunt deer in places like this, she said thoughtfully.
The secret is to convince the animals that the way out is the way they want to go. How do you do that?
Ayana smiled, and, for the first time since he had met her, Thomas saw genuine warmth in her expression. Very carefully, and with great patience.
Would you trust me to help you with this, Thomas McKenna?
Looking into her eyes, Thomas realized that somewhere during their long day together, his perception of Ayana had shifted. She was no longer just a strange Apache woman making impossible claims about marriage bonds. She was a capable partner who had already proven her worth through actions rather than words. I'd be grateful for the help, Thomas said, and meant it. As they worked together to plan their approach to the trapped cattle, Thomas began to understand that whether he accepted Ayana's beliefs about their bond or not, she had already become an important part of his life. The question was no longer whether he could escape the situation, but whether he wanted to. The plan Ayana proposed was unlike anything Thomas had ever attempted in his years of working cattle. Instead of the traditional approach of riding into the canyon and driving the animals out with noise and pressure, she suggested a method that relied on understanding the cattle's natural behavior and working with it rather than against it. Cattle are like people in some ways, Ayana explained as they positioned themselves near the canyon entrance. When they are frightened and trapped, they think only of escape. But, if you can show them a path that feels safe, they will choose it willingly. Thomas watched as Ayana gathered several handfuls of a particular grass that grew near the spring where they had rested earlier. She had noticed during their journey that the cattle seemed particularly attracted to this variety, and now she intended to use it as a lure. You want me to ride to the far end of the canyon and wait there, Ayana continued. But, do not show yourself to the cattle yet. I will enter the canyon on foot and begin to lead them toward the entrance using the grass. When they begin to move, you appear behind them, but slowly and quietly. You will be their encouragement to continue forward, not their reason to panic. Thomas had serious doubts about the plan. Entering a box canyon on foot with 8 nervous cattle was dangerous under the best of circumstances. These particular animals had recently survived a wolf attack and would be even more skittish than usual. It's too risky, Thomas said. If those cattle spook and stampede while you're on foot in that canyon, you'll be trampled to death. Ayana's dark eyes met his steadily. Do you trust me, Thomas McKenna? The question hung in the air between them like a challenge. Thomas realized that this moment was about more than just cattle or practical ranching methods. Ayana was asking him to demonstrate faith in her abilities, to show that he could accept her as an equal partner rather than someone who needed his protection. It's not about trust, Thomas said carefully. It's about unnecessary risk. I can't ask you to put yourself in danger for my job. You are not asking, Ayana replied. I am offering. And this is not about your job anymore, Thomas McKenna. This is about us learning to work together as partners. Thomas studied her face, seeing the determination there but also something deeper. She was testing him, he realized, but she was also testing herself. This was her way of proving that she could be valuable to him as more than just a burden or responsibility. All right, Thomas said finally. But, at the first sign of trouble, you get yourself out of that canyon. No cattle are worth your life. Ayana's smile was radiant. Now you begin to understand, she said softly. Partnership requires both trust and wisdom. Thomas rode around to the back of the canyon, picking his way carefully through the rocky terrain to avoid alerting the cattle to his presence. From his position, he could see the 8 animals clustered near a small seep at the far end of the box canyon. They looked tired and stressed, their heads hanging low as they rested in whatever shade they could find. Looking back toward the canyon entrance, Thomas could just make out Ayana's figure as she began to walk slowly into the narrow passage. She moved with the fluid grace he had come to associate with her, each step placed carefully to avoid loose stones that might create noise. Thomas found himself holding his breath as he watched her approach the cattle. The lead cow, an older female with distinctive markings, lifted her head as Ayana came into view. For a moment, Thomas was certain the animals would bolt, but, instead of panicking, the cow simply watched the approaching figure with cautious interest. Ayana began to speak to the cattle in her native language, her voice low and musical. Thomas couldn't understand the words, but the tone was somehow soothing, almost hypnotic. She held out handfuls of the sweet grass, letting the animals catch the scent. The lead cow took a tentative step forward, then another. Soon she was within arm's reach of Ayana, who offered the grass with patient, non-threatening movements. The cow accepted the offering and began to chew contentedly, her entire demeanor shifting from nervous alertness to calm acceptance. One by one, the other cattle moved closer, drawn by the sweet grass and Ayana's calming presence. Thomas watched in amazement as she gradually turned the entire group and began to lead them toward the canyon entrance, always staying just far enough ahead to encourage them to follow while never pressuring them to move faster than they were comfortable with. When the cattle were about halfway through the canyon, Thomas began to make his appearance as planned. He stayed well back, just visible enough to provide gentle encouragement for the animals to continue moving forward. The strategy worked perfectly. The cattle, already committed to following Ayana toward the grass she offered, accepted his presence as a natural part of their environment. Within an hour, all 8 cattle were safely out of the canyon and gathered with the 5 they had captured earlier. Thomas couldn't quite believe what he had witnessed. Ayana's method had been not only successful but completely stress-free for both the animals and the humans involved. That was remarkable, Thomas said as they worked together to organize the small herd for the journey back to the Bartee Ranch. I've never seen anything like it. My grandfather taught me that all living things respond better to invitation than to force, Ayana replied. He was a great hunter, but he said the best hunts were those where the prey chose to come to you. As they began the long drive back toward the ranch, Thomas found himself looking at Ayana with new respect. Her unconventional approach to handling the cattle had demonstrated not only practical knowledge but also a deep understanding of animal psychology that most experienced cowboys never developed. The journey home proved to be equally educational. Ayana seemed to have an instinctive understanding of the terrain, frequently suggesting route changes that saved time or avoided difficult ground. When they encountered a small washout that might have caused problems for the cattle, she quickly identified an alternate path that circumvented the obstacle entirely. As the afternoon wore on, Thomas began to relax and actually enjoy Ayana's company. Without the pressure of the rescue and the initial shock of her marriage declaration, he was able to appreciate her intelligence and humor. She asked thoughtful questions about ranch life and cattle management, and her observations about the behavior of the animals were consistently insightful. You mentioned that you were traveling to Tucson on business, Thomas said during a brief rest stop. If you don't mind me asking, what kind of business? Ayana's expression became more serious. I have family there, she said. My mother's sister married a Mexican trader who works with both Apache and white customers. She sent word that there are Apache children in Tucson who have been taken from their families and placed in the white man's school there. Some of these children belong to our band, and the families want them back. Thomas felt a knot form in his stomach. The government's policy of forcibly educating Apache children in white schools was a source of constant tension between the authorities and the tribes. He had heard stories of children being taken from their families and forbidden to speak their native language or practice their traditional customs. That's dangerous business, Thomas said carefully. The authorities don't look kindly on anyone trying to interfere with their Indian education programs. I know, Ayana replied. But these children are suffering, and their families are suffering. Someone must speak for them. Thomas was beginning to understand that there was much more to Ayana than he had initially realized. She wasn't just a young Apache woman who had gotten lost in the wilderness. She was someone who took on dangerous responsibilities to help her people, someone who was willing to risk her own safety for the welfare of others. What exactly do you plan to do in Tucson? Thomas asked. I will speak with the authorities and try to arrange for the children to visit their families, Ayana said. If that fails, I will find other ways to help them maintain connections to their heritage. Thomas could read between the lines. If legal approaches failed, Ayana was prepared to take more direct action to help the children. The thought both impressed and worried him. You know that could get you arrested or worse, Thomas said. I know, Ayana replied calmly. But some things are worth the risk. As they continued driving the cattle homeward, Thomas found himself thinking about Ayana's mission in Tucson. The more he learned about her, the more he realized that she was exactly the kind of person he had always admired, someone who stood up for what was right regardless of the personal cost. The sun was beginning to set when they finally reached the boundaries of Bartee Ranchland. The familiar landscape of home pastures and fence lines was a welcome sight after the long day in the wilderness, but Thomas found himself oddly reluctant for the journey to end. Despite the unusual circumstances of their meeting, he had genuinely enjoyed working with Ayana and getting to know her. "Thomas McKenna," Ayana said as they approached the ranch buildings, "I have something I must ask of you." "What's that?" "When we reach your ranch, how will you explain my presence to your boss and the other workers?" Thomas had been dreading this question. Samuel Turner was a decent man, but he shared the typical frontier attitudes about Apache people. The recent wars had left most white settlers suspicious and hostile toward any Apache, regardless of their individual circumstances. "I'll tell them the truth," Thomas said finally. "That I found you in trouble and helped you out. Turner's a fair man. He won't turn away someone who needs assistance." Ayana studied his face carefully. "And will you tell them about the bond between us?" Thomas felt his heart skip a beat. In the course of their long day together, he had almost forgotten about Ayana's claim that they were bound together in some kind of Apache marriage. Now, faced with the prospect of explaining the situation to his boss and co-workers, the full complexity of his predicament came flooding back. "I don't think that would be wise," Thomas said slowly. "At least not right away. People around here might not understand." "But you are beginning to understand," Ayana said. It wasn't a question. Thomas looked at her, seeing the hope in her dark eyes, and realized that somewhere during their day together, something fundamental had shifted in his thinking. He was no longer rejecting her claim about the bond between them outright. Instead, he was beginning to consider the possibility that she might be right about their connection. "Maybe I am," Thomas admitted quietly. As they drove the cattle into the ranch yard, Thomas saw several of the other hands coming out to help with the animals. Their faces showed curiosity and some suspicion when they noticed Ayana, but they followed Thomas's lead in treating her with basic courtesy. Samuel Turner himself emerged from the ranch house as they finished penning the recovered cattle. He was a big man in his 50s, with graying hair and the weathered face of someone who had spent his life working under the harsh Arizona sun. "McKenna," Turner called out. "Looks like you had some success tracking down those strays." "Yes, sir," Thomas replied. "Found 13 head total. Lost 7 to wolves, but the rest are in good shape." Turner's eyes moved to Ayana, who stood quietly beside Thomas's horse. "And who might this be?" "This is Miss Ayana," Thomas said, choosing his words carefully. "I found her in some trouble out in the canyon country. She helped me recover the cattle." Turner's expression remained neutral, but Thomas could see the wheels turning in his boss's mind. "I see. Well, any friend of McKenna's is welcome here, I suppose. You'll be staying for supper, miss?" Ayana looked to Thomas before answering, and he nodded encouragingly. "I would be honored," she said, her English formal but clear. As the ranch hands dispersed to care for the horses and cattle, Turner drew Thomas aside for a private word. "McKenna," Turner said quietly, "I don't want to pry into your business, but you need to be careful. There's been talk lately about Apache renegades in the area, and some of the local ranchers are getting jumpy. Having an Apache woman here, even a friendly one, might cause problems." Thomas felt a surge of protectiveness toward Ayana. "She's no renegade, Mr. Turner. She's a lady who was in trouble, and I couldn't leave her to die." "I'm not questioning your motives," Turner said. "But you need to think about the bigger picture. What are your plans for her?" Thomas looked across the yard to where Ayana was standing, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant shades of orange and red. The question Turner had asked was one he wasn't ready to answer, but he was beginning to suspect he already knew what the answer would be. "I'm still working on that, sir," Thomas said finally. That evening at supper, Ayana charmed the entire household with her quiet dignity and intelligence. She answered questions about Apache customs and culture with grace, never taking offense at ignorant remarks or hostile attitudes. By the end of the meal, even the most suspicious of the ranch hands were treating her with genuine respect. Turner's wife, Mary, was particularly taken with their guest. "You must stay the night," she insisted. "It's far too dangerous for a woman to travel alone after dark, especially in this country."
Ayanna glanced at Thomas before accepting the invitation.
As the evening wound down and the household prepared for bed, Thomas found himself alone with Ayanna on the ranch house porch. "Your friends are kind people," Ayanna said, looking out at the star-filled sky. "They're good folks," Thomas agreed. "A little rough around the edges, but their hearts are in the right place." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds of the desert.
Finally, Ayanna spoke again. "Tomorrow I must continue to Tucson," she said. "Will you come with me, Thomas McKenna?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that went far beyond a simple journey to town. Thomas knew that if he accompanied Ayanna to Tucson, he would be making a choice about their relationship, accepting her claim about the bond between them in a way that would be difficult to reverse. "Ayanna," Thomas began, then stopped.
He wasn't sure what he wanted to say or even what he was feeling.
"You do not have to answer now," she said gently. "But you must decide soon.
The children I spoke of cannot wait forever." As Thomas looked at her in the moonlight, he realized that his decision was already made. He couldn't let her face the dangers of Tucson alone, and, more than that, he didn't want to. Somewhere in the course of their day together, Ayanna had become important to him in ways he was only beginning to understand. "I'll come with you," Thomas said quietly.
Ayanna's smile was brilliant in the moonlight.
"Then, we will face whatever comes together," she said.
"As it should be."
That night, as Thomas lay in his bunk listening to the quiet sounds of the sleeping ranch, he reflected on the day's events and the choice he had just made. Less than 24 hours ago, he had been a simple ranch foreman concerned only with finding some missing cattle. Now he was bound to an Apache woman by bonds he didn't fully understand, committed to a journey that might put both their lives at risk. The strangest part was that he felt more at peace with himself than he had in years. For the first time in his adult life, Thomas McKenna was following his heart instead of just his head, and, despite the uncertainty ahead, it felt like exactly the right thing to do. The morning sun had barely cleared the eastern mountains when Thomas loaded supplies into his saddlebags and prepared to leave the Bartee Ranch. Samuel Turner had been understanding about his request for extended leave, especially after Thomas explained that he was helping Ayanna with urgent family business in Tucson. "Take as much time as you need, McKenna," Turner had said over breakfast. "You've been working steady for 3 years without a real break. Besides, you brought back those cattle when most men would have written them off as lost.
The ranch owes you."
Mary Turner had packed extra food for their journey and had quietly slipped Ayanna a small bag of medicinal herbs. For emergencies, she had whispered. A woman traveling in this country needs to be prepared for anything. As they rode away from the ranch, Thomas felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension. The journey to Tucson would take them through some of the most dangerous territory in the Arizona Territory, land where Apache renegades, bandits, and hostile wildlife posed constant threats to travelers. More than that, he wasn't entirely sure what they would find when they reached their destination. Ayanna rode behind him on a gentle mare that Turner had insisted on lending her. She sat the horse with natural grace, though Thomas could tell she preferred traveling on foot. Apache women were renowned for their endurance and ability to cover vast distances at a steady trot, but even the strongest runner would struggle to keep pace with mounted travelers over the 40-mile distance to Tucson. "Tell me more about these children you're trying to help," Thomas said as they settled into the rhythm of long-distance travel.
Ayanna's expression grew somber.
"There are 6 children from our band at the Tucson Indian School," she said. "The youngest is only 7 years old, taken from his grandmother's care last spring. The oldest is a girl of 14 who was my friend since childhood.
Their families have had no word of their welfare for many months."
Thomas had heard stories about the Indian schools, though he had never seen one personally. The government's policy was to educate Native American children in white ways, teaching them English, Christianity, and practical skills while forbidding them to speak their native languages or practice their traditional customs. Supporters claimed it was necessary to help Indian children integrate into modern American society. Critics called it cultural destruction.
What exactly happens at these schools? Thomas asked.
They cut the children's hair short, dress them in white man's clothing, and punish them severely for speaking Apache or practicing any of our customs, Ayana explained, her voice tight with controlled anger. They are taught that everything about their heritage is savage and wrong, that they must forget their families and their people to become civilized. Thomas felt a stab of sympathy for both the children and their families.
That's harsh treatment for young ones.
It is worse than harsh, Ayana said. It is the murder of souls. A child who forgets his people, his language, his connection to the land and the spirits, becomes empty inside. He belongs nowhere, accepted fully by neither white nor Apache society. As they traveled south through the increasingly rugged terrain, Ayana told Thomas more about the traditional Apache way of raising children. In her culture, children were considered sacred gifts who learned by observation and participation rather than formal instruction. They were taught to be self-reliant and strong, but always within the context of their connection to family, clan, and the natural world. Apache children learn by doing, Ayana explained.
A boy learns to hunt by following hunters, a girl learns to gather plants by going with the women.
They are never separated from their families during their learning years because knowledge without connection becomes meaningless. The contrast with the institutional approach of the Indian schools was stark, and Thomas began to understand why the separation was so traumatic for Apache families. In their worldview, removing children from their cultural context wasn't education but devastation. As the day progressed, they encountered other travelers on the rough trail that served as the main route to Tucson. Most were merchants or ranchers who nodded politely and continued on their way, but Thomas noticed that Ayana's presence drew suspicious glances and whispered conversations. Their first real challenge came in the early afternoon when they encountered a patrol of cavalry soldiers from Fort Huachuca. The blue-uniformed troopers, led by a young lieutenant with the soft look of someone new to frontier service, blocked the trail and demanded to know their business. "State your names and destination," the lieutenant ordered, his hand resting casually on his sidearm. "Thomas McKenna, and this is Miss Ayana," Thomas replied calmly.
"We're traveling to Tucson on personal business." The lieutenant's eyes focused on Ayana with obvious suspicion. "Apache?" he asked. "Yes," Ayana answered before Thomas could speak. "I am Apache." The soldiers tensed at her admission, hands moving closer to their weapons. Thomas felt his own hand drift toward his Colt, though he hoped it wouldn't come to violence. "What's an Apache doing traveling with a white man?" the lieutenant demanded. "And why should we believe you're not scouting for renegades?" Thomas felt his temper rise at the officer's hostile tone, but Ayana touched his arm in a calming gesture before answering herself. "I am traveling to Tucson to visit family members who work there legally," she said with quiet dignity. "Mr. McKenna is escorting me for protection during the journey. We have no hostile intentions toward anyone." The lieutenant studied them both for a long moment, clearly trying to decide whether to believe their story. Finally, he seemed to reach a decision. "You'll need to be careful," he said grudgingly. "There have been reports of Apache raiders in this area, and some of the local ranchers are talking about organizing militia patrols. A lone Apache woman might be mistaken for a hostile." "We'll be careful," Thomas said. "Thank you for the warning." As the soldiers rode away, Thomas turned to Ayana with concern. That was tense. "Are you going to have problems like this all the way to Tucson?" "Probably," Ayana replied matter-of-factly. "But it is nothing I have not faced before. Fear makes people say and do foolish things, but most are not truly evil." Her calm acceptance of the prejudice she faced impressed Thomas, though it also made him angry on her behalf. He was beginning to understand that Ayana lived in a world where she was constantly viewed with suspicion and hostility simply because of her heritage. They made good time through the afternoon, stopping only briefly to rest the horses and eat some of the food Mary Turner had packed for them. As evening approached, they reached a small settlement called Fairbank, little more than a cluster of buildings around a trading post and saloon. "We should stop here for the night," Thomas said, studying the darkening sky. "It's not safe to travel these trails after dark, especially with all the warnings we've been hearing about raiders."
The trading post owner, a grizzled man named Hendricks, was willing to rent them rooms for the night, though he made it clear that Ayana would need to stay in the smaller back room normally reserved for Mexican travelers. "Nothing personal," Hendricks said with obvious insincerity, "but some of my regular customers might not appreciate eating in the same room as an Apache." Thomas felt his jaw clench with anger, but, again Ayana's touch on his arm restrained him from saying something that might cause more problems. "The back room will be fine," she said quietly. "I do not need luxury, only safety." That evening, Thomas and Ayana ate their supper in the small back room while listening to the loud conversation and drinking in the main saloon. Most of the talk centered on complaints about Apache raids, government policies, and the difficulties of making a living on the frontier. Thomas was relieved that none of the other patrons seemed to have taken particular notice of Ayana.
"Does it bother you?" Thomas asked as they finished their meal. "The way people treat you, I mean." Ayana considered the question carefully.
"It saddens me," she said finally, "but it does not surprise me. Fear of the different is common among all peoples, not just whites. Some Apache fear and hate whites just as much as whites fear and hate Apache."
"But you don't." "No," Ayana said. "I have seen good and evil among both peoples. A person's character matters more than the color of their skin or the language they speak." Thomas found himself once again impressed by Ayana's wisdom and balanced perspective. Despite facing constant prejudice and discrimination, she had managed to maintain an open heart and a fair-minded approach to human relationships. Late that night, as Thomas lay in his narrow cot listening to the sounds from the saloon gradually die down, he heard a soft knock on his door. When he opened it, he found Ayana standing in the hallway with a troubled expression on her face. "There are men in the saloon talking about Apache raids near Tucson," she whispered. "They say the military is planning to restrict movement of all Apache people in the area. If this is true, I may not be able to reach the children." Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. "What kind of restrictions?" "They speak of rounding up all Apache and placing them on reservations until the raiding stops," Ayana said. "Any Apache found off the reservations would be considered hostile and subject to arrest or worse." Thomas quickly dressed and followed Ayana to a position where they could listen to the conversation in the main room without being seen. What they heard was deeply troubling. "I heard it from a friend who works at the fort," one of the men was saying. "Colonel Bradley is tired of chasing individual raiding parties. He's going to sweep the whole territory and put every Apache he can find behind barbed wire until this trouble ends." "About time," another voice replied. "These savages have been terrorizing honest folks for too long. Should have done it years ago." "When's this supposed to happen?" a third man asked. "Within the week," the first speaker said. "Bradley's already got authorization from the territorial governor. Any Apache found outside designated areas after next Sunday will be considered a hostile combatant." Thomas and Ayana exchanged worried glances. If the information was accurate, they had less than a week to reach Tucson and accomplish whatever Ayana hoped to do for the children at the school. "We need to leave early tomorrow," Thomas whispered as they returned to their rooms. "If we push hard, we can reach Tucson in 2 days instead of 3. "And if we encounter military patrols?" Ayana asked. Thomas had been thinking about that problem. "We'll have to hope they'll listen to reason. You're not a raider, and you have legitimate business in Tucson. Surely they can see the difference." Ayana's expression suggested she had less faith in military reason than Thomas did, but she nodded agreement with his plan. They left Fairbank before dawn, hoping to avoid attention and make maximum progress while the day was still cool. The trail to Tucson led through increasingly mountainous country, with narrow passes and rocky defile that would make perfect places for ambushes by either Apache raiders or suspicious military patrols. By mid-morning, they had covered nearly 15 miles without incident, but as they crested a ridge overlooking a broad valley, they saw something that made Thomas's heart sink. A large cavalry patrol was camped near a waterhole directly on their intended route, and, from the size of the camp, it looked like they were planning to stay in the area for a while. "We'll have to go around," Thomas said, studying the terrain with his field glasses. "That looks like at least 30 soldiers, and they've positioned themselves to control access to the water."
Going around will cost us most of a day, Ayana pointed out.
And there may be other patrols covering the alternate routes.
Thomas lowered his glasses and looked at his companion. Her face was set with determination, and he could see that she was weighing the risks of trying to bluff their way past the soldiers against the delays that would result from avoiding them.
What do you want to do? Thomas asked.
I want to reach those children before they disappear into some distant reservation where their families may never see them again, Ayana said firmly.
If that means taking risks, so be it. Thomas studied the military camp again, trying to assess their chances of talking their way through.
The soldiers would certainly stop them and question them extensively. Whether they would be allowed to continue would depend entirely on the commanding officer's interpretation of his orders and his personal attitudes toward Apache people.
All right, Thomas said finally. But we do this carefully. No sudden movements, no arguments with the soldiers, and if they decide to detain you, we don't resist.
We'll find another way to help the children. As they rode down into the valley toward the military camp, Thomas felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. His decision to accompany Ayana to Tucson was putting both of them in increasing danger, but there was no turning back now. Whatever happened next, they would face it together, just as Ayana had said they would when she declared their bond beside the canyon where he had saved her from the wolves. The irony wasn't lost on him that in trying to help her rescue Apache children from forced separation from their families, he was risking his own freedom and, possibly his life. But, as Thomas looked at Ayana riding beside him with quiet courage toward an uncertain confrontation, he knew he wouldn't change his choice even if he could. The cavalry camp was a model of military precision, with tents arranged in perfect rows and sentries posted at strategic points around the perimeter. As Thomas and Ayana approached, a corporal emerged from the main tent and raised his hand to signal them to halt. "State your business," the corporal demanded, his Spencer carbine held ready but not directly threatening. "We're traveling to Tucson," Thomas replied calmly. "I'm Thomas McKenna, ranch foreman from the Bar-T spread north of here.
This is Miss Ayana. We have business in town."
The corporal's eyes moved to Ayana with obvious suspicion.
"Apache?" "Yes," Ayana answered with quiet dignity.
"Wait here," the corporal ordered, then turned and walked quickly toward the largest tent in the camp. Thomas and Ayana sat their horses patiently while soldiers gathered around them, their faces showing mixtures of curiosity and hostility. Thomas noticed that several of the troopers were quite young, probably new recruits from back east who had never encountered Apache people except in the context of warfare. After what seemed like an eternity, the corporal returned accompanied by a tall, stern-faced man wearing captain's bars. The officer approached them with the bearing of someone accustomed to command and uncomfortable with situations that didn't fit neatly into military regulations. "I'm Captain Morrison," the officer said curtly.
"I understand you're traveling with an Apache woman. Are you aware that we have orders to detain all Apache found outside designated areas?"
Thomas felt his heart sink, but he forced himself to remain calm.
"Sir, Miss Ayana is not a raider or renegade. She's traveling to Tucson on legitimate family business. I'm escorting her for protection."
Morrison studied them both carefully.
"What kind of family business?" Thomas glanced at Ayana, who nodded slightly.
They had discussed this possibility and decided that honesty was their best strategy if confronted by military authorities. "There are children from her band at the Indian school in Tucson," Thomas explained. "Their families are concerned about their welfare and want to arrange visits."
Morrison's expression hardened.
"The Indian school has strict policies about family contact. These policies exist for good reasons." "I'm sure they do, sir," Thomas said diplomatically.
"But surely you can understand a family's concern for their children's welfare."
For a long moment, Morrison remained silent, clearly wrestling with his orders and his personal judgment. Finally, he made his decision. "I'm going to allow you to continue to Tucson," he said, "but with conditions. You'll travel with an escort of 2 of my men, and Miss Ayana will report to the military commander in Tucson immediately upon arrival.
Any deviation from this arrangement will result in her immediate arrest as a hostile Apache."
Thomas wanted to argue, but he could see from Ayana's expression that she considered the terms acceptable.
We understand, sir. Thank you for your consideration.
Morrison assigned 2 young troopers to accompany them, Privates Williams and Carter, both of whom seemed more excited by the opportunity to visit Tucson than concerned about their escort duties. As they resumed their journey south, Thomas found himself oddly grateful for the military presence, as it would prevent any confrontation with suspicious civilians along the way. The young soldiers proved to be pleasant traveling companions, eager to hear stories about ranch life and curious about Apache customs. Ayanna answered their questions patiently, gradually winning them over with her intelligence and quiet humor. By the time they stopped for their midday rest, both troopers were treating her with genuine respect rather than military suspicion. "Begging your pardon, Miss," Private Williams said during lunch, "but you're not like what we expected an Apache to be like."
Ayanna smiled gently. "And what did you expect, Private Williams?"
The young soldier blushed. "Well, the officers always talk about Apache as if they're all bloodthirsty savages."
"But you seem like a lady."
"People are individuals," Ayanna replied. "Some are good, some are bad, regardless of their race. Your officers have seen Apache during wartime, when both sides are fighting for their lives.
That is not the best time to judge anyone's true character."
As the afternoon progressed, Thomas found himself impressed once again by Ayanna's ability to bridge cultural differences through patient explanation and gentle correction of misconceptions. The 2 soldiers, who had started the journey viewing her as a potential threat, were now competing to assist her with small courtesies. They reached Tucson just as the sun was setting, the adobe buildings of the town glowing golden in the evening light. The settlement had grown considerably since Thomas's last visit, with new buildings sprawling beyond the original Spanish colonial core. The streets bustled with activity despite the late hour, as merchants, ranchers, soldiers, and various frontier characters went about their business. The military commander in Tucson proved to be Colonel Bradley himself, the man they had heard mentioned in Fairbank as the architect of the new Apache detention policy. Bradley received them in his office at the military headquarters, a stern-faced veteran with graying hair and the bearing of someone who had seen too much frontier violence.
"Miss Ayanna," Bradley said after reviewing the escort report, "I understand you want to visit children at the Indian school. I'm afraid that's not possible under current circumstances." "Why not?" Ayanna asked quietly. "Because contact with family members undermines the educational process," Bradley replied. "These children are learning to function in civilized society. Reminders of their primitive past only confuse them and slow their progress." Thomas felt anger rising in his chest at the colonel's dismissive tone, but Ayanna remained calm. "These children have parents and grandparents who love them," she said. "They have families who worry about their health and happiness. Surely love is not primitive or uncivilized." Bradley's expression softened slightly, but his resolve remained firm. "I understand your concerns, but the policy exists for good reasons. The children are better off learning to adapt to their new circumstances without conflicting influences." "May I at least see them?" Ayanna asked. "Just to confirm that they are well?" Bradley considered this request. "I suppose that would be acceptable, as long as there's no direct contact. You may observe them during their evening meal tomorrow, but from a distance and with military supervision." It wasn't what Ayanna had hoped for, but it was better than nothing. She accepted the colonel's conditions with grace, and arrangements were made for the visit the following evening. That night, Thomas and Ayanna stayed at a small hotel near the town center. As they sat on the hotel's front porch after dinner, watching the desert stars emerge in the clear sky, Thomas finally found the courage to address the question that had been weighing on his mind throughout their journey. "Ayanna," he said carefully, "this bond you believe exists between us. What happens now?" She turned to look at him, her dark eyes reflecting the starlight. "What do you think should happen, Thomas McKenna?" "I think," Thomas said slowly, "that somewhere between the canyon where I found you and this porch where we're sitting now, I've come to understand what you meant about belonging to each other." Ayanna's smile was radiant. "And what have you understood?" Thomas took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts. "I've understood that what binds 2 people together isn't just romance or physical attraction, though those things matter.
It's shared values, mutual respect, and the willingness to face life's challenges as partners. You've shown me all of those things in the past few days.
And? Ayana prompted gently.
And I've realized that I don't want to imagine my life without you in it, Thomas said quietly. Not because some Apache tradition says I have to feel that way, but because I genuinely care about you and admire who you are. Ayana reached out and took his hand in hers.
Then, you accept the bond between us?
I accept it, Thomas said. But I want you to know that it's my choice, made freely, not just because I saved your life from those wolves. It has always been your choice, Ayana said softly. The bond was created by your actions, but it could only be completed by your acceptance.
That is the way of my people.
They sat in comfortable silence for a while, holding hands and watching the stars wheel overhead. Thomas felt a deep sense of peace settling over him, as if he had finally found something he hadn't even known he was looking for. The next evening, they were escorted to the Indian school by 2 soldiers. The building was a stark, institutional structure that bore no resemblance to the natural settings where Apache children traditionally learned about life. Through a window, they could observe the evening meal being served in a large, sterile dining hall. Thomas watched Ayana's face as she saw the children for the first time. Her expression remained calm, but he could see the pain in her eyes as she observed young Apache children sitting in rigid rows, eating in silence while being supervised by stern white teachers. There, Ayana whispered, pointing to a small boy near the back of the room. That is Little Bear, taken from his grandmother last spring. And there is Running Deer, my friend since childhood. The children looked healthy but subdued, their natural Apache clothing replaced by identical gray uniforms, their traditionally long hair cut short in white fashion. They ate mechanically, without conversation or laughter, under the watchful eyes of their supervisors. They look so sad, Thomas murmured. They look empty, Ayana corrected. They are being taught to forget who they are, but they have not yet learned who they are supposed to become. They exist in between, belonging nowhere. As they watched, one of the younger children, a girl of perhaps 8 years old, dropped her spoon. When she bent to retrieve it, a teacher immediately reprimanded her in harsh tones, making her stand beside her seat as punishment for the minor accident.
The child's face showed no emotion.